Have you ever felt the highway breathe? Not the kind of breath you notice in daylight. No engines idling, no truckers arguing over lanes. This is the slow exhale of a road after midnight, a hush that fills the spaces between headlights. At that hour, the world narrows to a strip of asphalt, the glow of your dashboard and whatever choices you made to be alone. Tonight I have 5 stories about that hour. Things that happened when the lights went down, and the only witnesses were the moon and a handful of passing cars. A warning before we begin. These stories contain violence and moments that can be triggering. If you need to pause, do it. There will be resources at the end. There. Our first story comes from a woman who asked to remain anonymous. She drives the kind of road that eats cell reception, the long stretches through Arizona where gas stations are mercy and the next town is a thought. She worked nights. Pulling a 2 a.m. shift was ordinary. That night the engine coughed in a way it hadn't before. She pulled over to the shoulder, blinked at the dark, and got out to look. The air smelled like hot metal and desert dust. Her breath steamed in the cooling air despite the desert heat. Her phone spun and showed no bars. She felt small on that shoulder, a person against a vast, indifferent landscape. Then a van came up behind her, headlights folded over the shoulder like a hand. The driver slowed, rolled his window down, and called out something like help. He named himself Clay, the kind of name you remember because it's ordinary and therefore less suspicious. He offered a flashlight, a jump, the kind of help you accept because your alternatives are uncertain and cold. At first he was the good Samaritan. He even stayed a beat under the glow of his dome light while she checked the hood. The engine refused to cough to life. Rain wasn't an option, but the dark had its own cold weight. Something shifted the minute she said she would call for a tow. The tone in his voice slid. He asked where she was headed. He found a joke in the loneliness of a woman alone at night. He offered to follow for a few miles, just to make sure you get to a lit place. She felt watched. The air tightened. There were smaller signs she didn't register at first. How his smile sat wrong in the light, how his words came too quickly when she tried to be polite. When she asked him to leave, he laughed. The laugh landed flat in the empty road. He reached into the van and pulled out a gun. That's the kind of sentence that makes the blood do arguing things in your body. He didn't fire immediately. He wanted something else. Power. Fear. He forced her to kneel in the shoulder gravel, asked her to take off her shoes, told her to write a note to someone she loved. He made her write goodbyes. He filmed parts of it. He laughed when she cried. He called the camera a keepsake. He wanted a record. He wanted to hold her terror in his hands, like proof. She remembers the scrape of gravel under her knees. She remembers the heat of the dashboard light catching sweat on her lips. He asked questions, then corrected the stories she told herself to stay steady. "You'll be quiet," he said, "and nice." He made her kneel and say things into his phone. She mouthed words she didn't want to speak. At one point he mock-applauded her and then struck her. The blow landed near her face. The world went a tone paler. She remembers a ringing that wasn't quite in her ears, and a black starburst where her sight hiccuped. When he left, because he did leave, he left one thing clearly behind, the knowledge that whatever he had of that night could exist forever in small, invisible files. A recording, a picture, proof of degradation captured to be watched later. He sped away, and the tail lights smudged into the dark like a final punctuation mark. She lay there until headlights approached from the other direction. An old truck slowing down, an ordinary man named Gary, who would not have been the first person you'd expect to be a rescuer. He found her, helped her into his cab, and drove her until a highway station had a phone and a sympathetic voice to call an ambulance. They said later that he had hit her so hard that her orbital socket was fractured. The medical words were blunt and efficient, the doctor's hands gentler than the memory. She had internal bruising, a concussion that dissolved short chunks of time. There were stitches and a slow sterile sun that moved across hospital blinds. She remembers waking in a fluorescent world where her life felt patched together by the hands of strangers. But the worst thing wasn't the pain. It was the idea that someone might have footage, an hour or two stored on a device somewhere, of her at her most helpless. She tried to tell the officers everything she could remember. She tried to describe the van, the tire tread, the van's paint. Memory is a fickle thing after blunt trauma. The license plate blurred into a smear, despite how hard she reached for it. She left the police station with a list of questions that had no answers. The man they called Clay was a silhouette too easy to sketch and too vague to catch. After the immediate violence and the ER haze came the sifted aftermath. The insurance calls, the brittle texts from strangers asking how she was, the friend who put ice on her cheek and cried without being able to name why. There was gratitude. Gary had stopped. Strangers had stopped. But that gratitude was threaded through with a deeper, dull fear. The fear had a name she couldn't shake. Record. At night she started replaying the silhouette of the van in her head. She pictured small electronic boxes, memory cards, cloud accounts, the detachability of life. She imagined fingers scrolling through hours of her fear, like someone watching a film. That idea burned. It was sharper than the physical pain. At 3 in the morning, while the world went soft, and her boyfriend, now husband, because the couple married later as part of a tender, complicated healing, slept beside her, she would wake shaking with the knowledge that an image could be passed from hand to hand without her permission. She would sit on the edge of their bed and sweat the small things. Had she mouthed his name? Did she scream at any point? Was there a timestamp, a geolocation, a voice that could be matched to a face? Her life after that night lived in halves. There was the life before, late shifts, the unremarkable strangeness of driving alone, and the life after, which rearranged itself around hypervigilance. She learned to check the backseat of cars instinctively, to avoid shoulders on highways, to prefer parking lots with cameras. She stopped using the shoulder as an impromptu place to breathe. The world became a series of tiny choices meant to blunt the edges of the past. She tried therapy. She tried telling people who loved her parts of the story and keeping other parts private. The small humiliations, being asked the same, predictable questions by strangers, felt like a second little assault. And there was the memory problem. Days without snapshots. Phone calls she could not remember placing. All of which terrified her more than wearing sunglasses to hide bruises. Without a clear record, you start to doubt yourself. Most days she feared she'd imagined things into being. The body remembers differently than the mind. It keeps the after images, the jump in breath, the stomach's refusal to settle. Sometimes she couldn't trust which parts of the night belonged to her, and which were courtesy of the concussion's patchwork. What made it worse was the quiet places people leave at night. The shoulder where she'd pulled over was the same stretch of road she drove every week. That road did not change into a safer place. Her husband would insist on driving her the long way around, past lights and diners and the hum of other lives. She would refuse sometimes and choose the short route, because moving through fear was part of reclaiming a map she had once depended on. At night, though, she still felt that the world had contracted to the width of a taillight and a gun barrel. I don't want to dramatize every second because the truth is heavier without decoration. What is true, what she told me in clipped sentences over a late-night phone call, is that she still sometimes imagines a camera's soft red eye watching a moment that was not meant to be watched. She asked that we not attach this to a name, that if you remember nothing else from what I read, you remember that someone stopped and helped her. She married the person who stayed. She lives with scars that do not show. That was one way the night turned against her. It was a night of predation and a subsequent life of small, careful repairs. It is also only the beginning of what happens after dark, the way ordinary spaces can be interrupted by strangers, how trauma ripples into the mundane. If this is the sort of thing that sits with you, if these late-night stories hit a nerve, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you have something that happened to you after dark, send it our way. We take submissions and read them with care. The second story is, in a way, the echo of the first. The way a single violent night refracts into years. It's the same woman's voice again, but the time is later, months, years later, and the scene moves from the shoulder of a highway to the narrow private rooms where healing also fails to keep pace. She told me about the nights when she would play that terrible stretch of road in her mind until she could feel the gravel in her palms. She told me about small, uncanny things that made her suspect a recording might not be a hypothetical anymore. What we have to be careful about here is how easily the mind translates fear into fact. There is an honest space between I think and I know. She never told the police she had proof. There was no evidence recovered that made the nights replayable for strangers to watch. There was only an insistent feeling, like static under a radio frequency, that someone out there had a file. Sometimes the feeling came in the form of a number on her phone she couldn't identify. Other times, it was in the way a stranger's eyes lingered too long at a coffee shop window. She would spin small narratives in her head and then apologize for them later. Months after the assault, she received something else that collected into her anxiety. I will not invent details that weren't in her message to me, but I can tell you the tenor. There was a rumor, a whisper she heard second-hand, a story about a van seen near a different town, someone who moved quickly, someone who liked to videotape things. It wasn't specific enough for the police to act on. The officers she dealt with were professional. They had their own caseloads and holes in evidence. The system is not always set up to catch silhouettes. So she did the things survivors are pushed to do, both by circumstance and by a need for agency. She watched for patterns. She noted van colors. She wrote down partial times. She kept a list, a little ledger of possible sightings that mostly amounted to nothing. The ledger, however, gave her something like a map. It was proof she was trying. She started sleeping with the light on more often. She refused to ride in cars on certain days. She answered the phone with suspicion. Her relationship, first comforting, then strained in ways love cannot always predict, began to rearrange around these tiny rituals. She told me that marriage did not untangle fear. It shared it. Her husband learned how to sit with her when the panic rose, how to hold her without demanding explanation. Months slid into years, and the fear remained a low-grade companion. Sometimes she tried to imagine the man's face, bored or cruel, ordinary in a way that made him more terrifying. Other times she pictured him as faceless, a sliding shadow that could be anyone. She did not want to live the rest of her life with that image lodged behind her eyelids, but she also could not make herself forget. That tension, between wanting to forget and wanting to keep watch, is a slow kind of violence. And then the detail that made her blood run cold. The possibility of being watched afterwards. She described how images, once taken, don't belong to you anymore. They are files that can be copied, that can be spread, that can be weaponized. The idea of your worst moment becoming someone else's entertainment is a particular cruelty. She never said she had seen the footage. She said only that the chance it existed kept her awake. A few nights she drove past the shoulder and breathed in the same air and thought maybe for a second it would feel neutral again, like a place with no story attached. But it wasn't neutral. The road was a postcard of that night. She could not unsee the hand on the phone, the camera lens catching the angle of a head as it fell forward. She moved through therapy sessions learning to tolerate the memory. She learned which thoughts could be challenged and which had to be softened with time. One evening, months after the assault, she received a voicemail. The message was brief and the voice unknown. It said something she could not place, an apology, a line from a commercial, a wrong number. But its cadence hooked something deep in her. She listened to it twice, then stopped. She handed the phone to her husband and said, "Play it." He listened with a thicker skin than she had grown, and then he looked at her with a kind of careful, frightened curiosity. They both felt the same invisible thing. An audience might exist, but that was all they had, a feeling and a short, inscrutable audio file that could easily be a coincidence. You see how this compounds. The mind builds scaffolding for terror out of tiny bricks of ambiguity. She started carrying a small recorder on her person, half to trick herself into feeling protected, half to catch anomalies. It was a plain human improvisation. If there's a chance someone filmed you, then owning an audio record feels perversely like swapping roles. The recorder did not find anything definitive. It found only the sound of a highway, the rustle of her jacket, and once, long after the assault, a man's voice talking about drywall in a tone that did not belong to the region. Nothing you could build a case from. Nothing the police could do anything with. Between the nights she was brave enough to drive and the days she chose to stay home, a strange domestic choreography took shape. Her husband learned to check every shadow before he pulled the curtains. Friends learned particular phrases that were safe to say. "You're steady. I'm here. We'll get through this. Her survival was an accumulation of these small allyships. She learned too that recovery can be a compromise. You accept the parts of the world you can steady and leave the rest messy for a while. She told me she became paranoid in new ways. She avoided certain bathroom mirrors. She deleted apps whose permissions felt invasive. She learned the precise rhythm of a stranger's footstep in a hallway because that twice jolted her awake in the middle of the night. She told me about a year when she would not let anyone take pictures of her at birthday gatherings. Pictures had become potential weapons, and yet, amidst the fear and the rituals, came moments of stubborn, ordinary courage. She went back to work. She laughed sometimes. She and her husband took a trip where they sat side by side on a plane and watched a movie, and did not, for a brief stretch, think about the highway. Those moments are not the end of the story. They are proof that trauma coexists with resilience, but resilience is its own kind of labor. It does not erase the possibility that the past can leak forward. It's at this point in our telling that the line between a documented crime and a private terror gets blurry. She had no proof that the footage existed. She had no name to hand to a detective and say, "Lock him up." The system could only hold so much of what she needed. You hear this in many submissions, that the law can take what you give it, but it cannot prescribe the rest of your nights. Here, the unresolved nature of the crime does as much harm as the crime itself. Not knowing keeps the wound open. As she described these years, she used a phrase that stayed with me. The thing that follows you is quieter than the thing that attacked you. Night becomes not only a space of danger, but a shadow that follows your life forward. The fear, for her, is a long tale. And then, just when you think history might fold into a new normal, something else happens. It is small and ambiguous, and that's what makes it worse. A neighbor mentions seeing a van like the one she'd described. A babysitter notes the same make and mutters it was parked near the wrong exit. Or a friend finds a video online of an incident from a different state and shows it off in a group chat, unaware of how the image might read to her. You do not need an arrest to feel hunted. You only need repetition. I'll pause here and say again, she never told me a definitive moment when some mysterious clip was delivered to a stranger's inbox. There was no incontrovertible evidence, no arrest, no closure. There were instead 100 flickers of possibility that stitched into a tapestry of dread. She learned to live alongside the fear and to shape a life that kept him, if he still existed, at a distance. We'll come back to this story because it folds into another theme I want us to explore: the way evidence, or the lack of it, changes the relationship survivors have to their own memories. For now, hold the image of a woman sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, scrolling through nothing and everything at once, because that is the particular cruelty of a world where footage can exist without your consent. That was the second tale, the quieter, longer, and perhaps cruelest part of trauma. Before we move on, a quick note. If anything in these first 2 stories hits close to home and you need immediate help, please reach out to local support services or a trusted person. If you want to share your story with us, there's a link in the episode notes with submission guidelines. We read every message carefully. Next is a submission from Rick. He works nights in a way most of us prefer not to think about. He cleans what the daylight cannot keep looking at. His job is to arrive after the police have left, after the photographers have taken their shots, and wipe a place into order. He described himself simply, a man who pushes a mop and tries not to make a life of the things he sees. Yet the thing about night jobs that touch violence is that ordinary people become furniture in someone else's misfortune. Rick's story begins with an alley and a heat that was too sticky for the hour. He arrived at the job with his crew, Frank, Choi, Randy, 3 men who had their routines down to muscle memory. They were used to the smell of iron and bleach and the way night took the edges off a space and made everything more textural. The scene that night was routine by the numbers, but not routine to the soul. A sex worker had been stabbed, the kinds of wounds that make a city more fragile for a while. The cops had taped off the alley. Flash photography had painted the walls with white strips of light. The crew put on their gloves and stepped into a world that had been violently still until then. He described the alley's details the way someone might describe a room they've learned to ignore. The dented dumpster, the faded graffiti, a stray cigarette butt. The lights from passing cars made everything move in bands. It was ugly and ordinary. They were cataloguing what to remove when a man appeared at the edge of the tape. He didn't come like someone looking for directions. He came like someone who owned the night. He called himself a pastor. This is the phrase that Rick said slowly into his phone when he told me. A pastor, he repeated, as if the word ought to have been a talisman against the wrongness built into the man's actions. The man wore clothes that suggested he could be taken at face value. A coat that had seen weather, a crumpled collar, an expression that might have been prayerful in another life. But there is a kind of certainty in people who put themselves into dangerous spaces without asking permission, an assurance they are there for the soul, or at least their own version of it. He didn't just cross the tape and speak. He did something else, something that unmoored the men working the scene. He touched the victim's remains with his bare hands. He smeared blood on his fingers and, this is what the crew could not understand, he licked them. He spoke in a language none of them recognized, and afterward his face looked like someone who had tasted something forbidden and enjoyed it. The crew called the police. The man who had given a name and a claim to some shepherding duty became inscrutable. His presence at a crime scene, however spiritual sounding his title, was wrong. He had broken the ritual of the tape, the protocol that keeps evidence uncontaminated. But this was not merely contamination. The thing he had done felt personal, like someone making a private joke where others had been hurt. He seemed pleased, almost reverent. Rick and his crew confronted him. They told him he couldn't be there. He smiled in a way that suggested he felt larger than rules. He spoke again in a tongue that had no obvious origin. There was no clerical badge, no badge of any kind, just a man with a claim and an appetite. The police were called, they came and led him away, and they also seemed, in their own professional way, limited. There wasn't a crime that easily fit his actions. He had not assaulted anyone that the officers could prove. He had not stolen anything. He had done the unnameable. He had taken symbolic possession of the wound in a way that left the cleanup crew feeling wronged on a level the law could not touch. The men finished their work that night, with the oily aftertaste of something unsettling. They scrubbed, they sprayed, they boxed and carried, and tried to leave nothing behind that would reopen the place. But the image of the man with his fingers red and a smile like a blessing sat heavy in all their heads. Later, when Rick went home and puzzled about what he'd seen, he understood a different kind of danger. People out there who wear masks of comfort but carry cruelty. He told me he still sees that man sometimes in the margins of his memories, a figure who thinks himself holy while smiling at the blood of others. He does not know whether the man was a true believer who had snapped or a charlatan who used religious language to cloak his appetite. Either way, the scene lodged into the team's morale like a grain of sand under a pearl. It irritated, it brightened, and it refused to be ignored. We'll continue this thread and move to Kidwelly Castle next. But before we leave Rick's story for the night, I want you to imagine the moral vertigo of the moment. A man who claims to be a pastor at a crime scene and then acts like the opposite. Think about what that does to trust. Think about how the night can fill with people who present as saviors, but who, on closer look, are only performing their own darkness. That sense of false consolation transitions neatly into our next submission, which folds terror and the supernatural together. People who come to the dark seeking evidence of the paranormal and find something that may or may not be explainable. The location is Kidwelly Castle, a place that makes its own weather after dark, where stone walls absorb sound and history stacks like sediment. The legend linked to the castle, one Gwen Leanne Vergry, was something the team was there to document. They were filmmakers, seekers, and friends, and their leader, Ray, said more than once he felt something there. He was open, credulous, the sort of person whose belief was part of the magnetism that draws others to a place where the floorboards creak for reasons that might be old and might be malevolent. I'll stop here for now. There's more to tell about what happened at Kidwelly Castle, the way a vision becomes a fall, and the blurred border between grief-driven hallucination and something we cannot explain. We'll pick that up next. Stone stairs, a shout in the dark, the catch of a body, and the aftermath where friends argue quietly in hospital corridors about what they saw. For now, hold the sound of the castle wind in your mind, and the soft, persistent hum that the night makes when it wants your attention. They reached Kidwelly Castle when the light was thinning to the colour of old coin. The castle sits on a ridge that throws its shadow far into the valley. By the time the team climbed the last set of stone steps, the sky had gone the exact hue that makes every silhouette look like a claim. The wind there tastes like salt and old rain, even if the nearest sea is hours away. It moves through the arrow slits and throws voices into strange intervals. If you stood by a crumbling wall at dusk, you know the way cold seems to come from the stone itself. The castle does not need to do anything for the dark to feel heavy. It invites it. Andy described the night with the language of someone who films for a living. Notes about lenses, batteries, light meters. But those technicalities were just the frame. What the team wanted was a thing that lived between frames. The legend of Gwen Leanne Vergry. Gwen, according to local telling, was a woman who had loved a soldier, who had thrown herself from the battlements when love failed. The kind of story a place like Kidwelly collects and retells through local pub gossip and creaky guidebooks. Ray liked that kind of story. He liked the way a narrative could make a place come alive. He was the one who felt things first. He was the type of believer whose conviction made non-believers become attentive. They set up cameras in the Great Hall, on the spiral stairs and along the battlements. Andy did his work silently. He was the man who framed the myth. Sophie and Phil were there to record audio and take stills. They joked when nervous, the small human attempt to clamp laughter over a thin thread of fear. As the first beams of moonlight cut across the courtyard, Ray spoke in low, insistent tones about feeling someone there. He said it as if announcing a new arrival at a table. "I can feel her." The others smiled with the kind of indulgence people afford a friend nobody wants to contradict. For a while, nothing dramatic happened. Night has a patience that is different from human expectation. It will not perform on command. But the castle does have small phenomena that escalate belief. Doors that click shut when no one pushes them. Drafts that press cold against the back of your neck. The sense of being watched that combines building and myth into something intimate. They chase those things with microphones and flashlights and a curiosity that read like bravery. Then, halfway through an hour that Andy filmed on a shoulder-mounted rig, Ray moved away from the group. He said something about the battlements, something like, "She's on the north side," and walked fast enough that the others called after him. He climbed the spiral steps toward the turret, the camera catching his shoulders and the way his head turned as if following a voice only he could hear. The stones there are uneven by design. Centuries of feet have polished some parts smooth and left other steps sharp and abrupt. Ray's voice rose. At first it was a soft thing, a whisper meant for someone who had once lived in another century. Then he shouted, an attempt to name her, to break the silence. The shout had that terrible rawness of someone who is both pleading and commanding at once. People at the edge of a myth sometimes behave as if a myth were a person. They argue with it, bargain with it, cry out to it. Eyewitness accounts vary on what happened next. That is, as it should be. Memory attends to different details. Some said Ray saw something, an outline on the battlements, a hand reaching out, and panicked. Some said he said a name and then ran as if the name had pushed him. Others, including Andy, described the way Ray's legs slipped on the worn edge of a stair, how his hands seemed to close on empty air, how his body twisted as it fell. The fall was not cinematic. It was a brutal handful of seconds where the world narrowed and then expanded into pain. There are images that do not belong to any explanation. The camera's jerky focus as Ray tumbles, the sound of a body striking stone, the metallic ping of equipment. Andy's footage, not because anyone asked him to release it, but because he is a professional who documents the work he does, captures the minutiae of that drop. There is a moment in the footage where the only intelligible sound is the wind, then Ray's voice, sharp and furious, and then a heavier noise that is almost the sound of someone folding into themselves. They got him off the stairs. They called an ambulance. They did what friends do. They wrapped him, murmured to him, tried to create a line of ordinary contact that might patch the frightening seam. At the hospital, things went procedural. X-rays, CT scans, stitches, and a sterile room that smells like detergent and coffee. Ray survived the fall, vital signs redrawn and held, but he carried an injury that rearranged the way he remembered certain things. He had lacerations and a head trauma that in the week after began to do odd things to his memory. He could remember the camera setup, The jokes that had been made minutes before, the feel of his jacket. He could not later remember the bright clarity of the vision he had insisted he'd seen on the battlements. That absence is what pushed people to argue. Friends who were with him, exhausted and terrified, sat in hospital corridors and tried to reconcile the footage with Ray's amnesia. Sophie, who recorded everything, insisted she had captured sound that suggested more than the usual gust. Phil, quieter, said he had seen something white on the battlement, like fabric, moving in the wrong way. Andy kept to the footage, refusing to draw more than the images themselves would support. You could see how grief and hope read into the same frames. If someone has been injured in the same place as a legend, there is an appetite to tie wound to wonder. The images complicate things. There is rawness on the tape, Ray's voice, a shadow near the parapet, and then the fall. Does the shadow constitute proof? No. Does Ray's insistence that he had seen Gwen mean it was so? Not necessarily. The medical fact remained. Head trauma can produce hallucinations, brief but vivid. The post-concussive brain is an unreliable narrator. It stitches together memory like a dream trying to be a narrative. That reality sits beside another reality, people who swear they have seen something that is not explainable by neurology or by coincidence. In the weeks after, Ray's memory of the vision diminished in both detail and confidence. Where once he had described Gwen as a clear presence, someone looking back at him with a face like a photograph, he later would tell different versions, slipping names and colors and claiming he might be wrong. Sometimes he suggested he had been hearing the voice of someone he grieved, an uncle who had died recently and whose absence had left a fresh hollow. Grief and trauma twist together in ways that make definitive statements precarious. For some among the team, the memory's erosion was proof of a head injury's power. For others, it was an uncanny erasure, as if the castle had taken back a proof it had lent. Andy, who had framed the event, felt guilt like an afterburn. He wondered if his camera work had turned Ray's attention in a way it would not otherwise have gone. Did the act of filming make Ray perform the vision? Or was he only catching what existed independently of the lens? That question is a hazard of documentary work. The presence of a recorder changes the subject in unpredictable ways. Andy replayed the footage in his head, as if the camera could be rewound to a moment before any of it happened, and then edited out of history. He did not publish the footage. He kept it as evidence of what had happened, and as a burden he could not unload. There were practical consequences too. Ray could not return to normal work schedules immediately. He developed post-concussion symptoms, nausea, light sensitivity, fatigue, things that make the ordinary world hostile. He could not tolerate bright screens or loud rooms. He would wake and not remember the last few minutes of a conversation. Those blank spaces are terrifying. They feel like doors open to anything. While Ray recovered physically, the group debated. Some wanted to chalk the whole thing up to grief and neurochemistry. Others wanted to believe quietly that something there had reached out. Ray himself vacillated. In private messages to friends, he would be emphatic about what he had seen, then apologetic the next day when he could not reconstruct it. The castle sat outside these arguments, unchanged and indifferent. Stone does not care who believes in it. There is another line to draw here. Whatever Ray experienced, the human cost was clear. He had bled. He had been hurt. He had lost something he could no longer name. That loss shaped the team's dynamic. Sophie, who had once been eager to film every creak, found herself reluctant to go back. Phil started bringing a friend along as a buffer. Andy found that his cameras would not quite catch the thing he thought they had seen. The footage was partial, angle-limited, susceptible to interpretation. The event became less a proof and more a fissure in a group that had gone into the dark together. And there is the public side of these things. Kidwelly's legend had long made the castle a modest curiosity. After Ray's fall, rumors spread. People asked if they should close the site for safety. Others wanted to return, to stand where Ray had stood and look for the same thing. You can see the pattern. A traumatic event attached to place generates its own mythology. That can be harmless curiosity, or it can be a way for people to inscribe meaning onto suffering that would prefer to be left alone. Months later, When Ray's best moments of clarity came, he would press his palm to the glass on the living room window and say softly, "I swear she reached for me." Sometimes he would laugh in a sound that had edges and then fall silent. There is dignity in someone who cannot fully explain what they saw and yet refuses to be cynical about it. There is also a danger. When we cannot square trauma with narrative, we make the story into something else, into proof that fits our needs. Friends argued and then made peace. There was no grand pronouncement. There was recovery that moved sideways. Ray learned new habits to manage his sensitivity to light. Sophie stopped bringing cheap microphones and spent more time on small domestic film projects for work. Andy, who had once loved capturing strangeness, kept his hand steady on a different set of shoots. Weddings, corporate events, things with a predictable arc. The castle still stands. The stone breathes the same way. If you go to Kidwelly now, you'll find that later tours include a footnote about Ray's fall, an addendum to the legend rather than the legend itself. People bring flashlights that claim to be ghost hunting equipment. Some leave flowers on the battlements, others leave nothing at all. The thing that happened to Ray is neither wholly explained nor wholly supernatural. It sits, unresolved, like a pebble in a shoe, uncomfortable, persistent, and not always easy to talk about. That is a pattern we've seen in these submissions. The dark does not only house predation, it also houses grief, and the risk that grief will dress itself up as a thing proof can name. Whether the cause is human malice, the frailty of bone and brain, or something that resists tidy classification, the aftermath is always human. Stitches, apologies, changed habits, and friends who stay up too late talking. There's one more piece to this particular night that stuck with me. The way bystanders shape memory. On rewind, footage can be argued with, edited around, explained away. But what is not reversible are the micro-decisions, where Ray placed his hands on the stone, the way Sophie reached for him, the phone call that brought an ambulance. Those things are not proof of a ghost or of a neurological event. They are proof of people acting in shock and care. In the end, that might be the only kind of certainty we can afford, that we act imperfectly in the face of the unknown. Now, before our final tale, take a breath. If the last two stories have left your stomach hollow, that is the point. The dark presses. It asks questions. If any of this resonates, there are resources listed in the episode notes. And if you want to share something, please do. We read carefully. Composite, inspired vignette. This last tale is short and deliberately stitched from motifs that appear again and again in the messages we receive. The small horror of being watched, the terror that someone has a file of you at your worst, the paranoia that grows when you realize that images can exist without your consent. I do not present this as a single person's submission. It is a composite, constructed from recurring details across many accounts. Consider it an attempt to give shape to a fear that is unbearably common. Imagine walking into a motel room after midnight. The building hums with HVAC, its fluorescent lights buzzing in a way that makes the air feel nervous. You lock the deadbolt, you draw the drape. You take a shower and then notice in the steam a red speck shining like an eye near the dresser. You think it must be the reflection from a clock. You step closer, and the speck is still there. It winks. Not a wink, but the tiny steady pinprick of a recording LED. Your heart beats in a new rhythm. You call the front desk. They say they have no cameras facing rooms. You look at your phone. No apps are running that shouldn't be. You call the police and file a report. But the motel has a complicated ledger. The camera could be a motion sensor. The camera could be a cheap device a third party planted. The camera could be nothing. Your mind constructs 100 possibilities, each worse than the last. You cannot stop seeing the speck behind glass. You ask yourself what was recorded. You replay the last hour in your head and wonder what your voice sounded like, what you said, how you looked. Your skin goes cold because images once made do not belong to you anymore. Maybe you trace the red dot to a cheap webcam I heard about. Maybe it's an in-room smart device poorly secured. Maybe the file is already off-site, cached on a server in a city you have never heard of. Or maybe there is nothing. The absence of proof is indistinguishable from proof to a mind that needs certainty. You change passwords. You delete cloud backups. You run antivirus until your eyes blur. You become someone who understands technology, the way a person who has survived a storm becomes an amateur meteorologist. Or consider another version. You are driving home late and notice a car behind you that has been there for too long. It is the same model that your neighbor drives, same rims, same dent, but you cannot be sure. You make a roll of turns to test whether the car follows. It follows. Your chest tightens. You stop at a store. The car idles across the road. A man records his phone up like a talisman. He shrugs when you look at him. He could be recording the sky, he could be recording you. There is no way to ask without sounding paranoid. You return home and check your house for signs of tampering. You find none. You sleep with all lights on. You wake with exhaustion that cannot be cured. Maybe the most terrible scenario is the one that leaves no scars. There is no physical wound, only a knowledge. You realize a stranger might have a file of you unconsenting, walking, crying, terrified. The thought can be more violating than a physical blow because it persists in the hands of others. It can be copied, reframed, monetized. The idea alone changes behavior. You avoid windows, you quit bars, you stop going to parties. You curtail a life, so the unknown cannot be used as evidence of your weakness. These composite fears are not fanciful. They are the logical extension of technology into predation. Recording devices are small and cheap and can be used like proof or like weapons. Many people I speak with describe being haunted by the idea of footage, not by the footage itself. That terror bends your world in small ways. The way you sit in a parked car, the way you turn your head at a blurred reflection, the way you accept privacy as a fragile, negotiable thing. The composite vignette ends without an arrest, without resolution, because that is the truth of this motif. Sometimes there is a person who can be found, sometimes there is a server nobody will touch, sometimes there is only a feeling that something exists somewhere in the digital dark. The fear remains. It mutates into rituals, checking the corners of rooms, tapping cameras on returning rental items, carrying a small cheap device that beeps when it senses wireless cameras. These measures make you feel safer, and sometimes they are enough, but they also highlight the asymmetry. Someone else can take footage of you in a moment, and your recourse is messy and partial. I wanted to end with that image because it ties the other tales together. Not every terror is blood and stone. Some are smaller, invisible, and lingering. They change the way we move through the world after dark. When I read these submissions, the common thread is not always a villain you can name. It is vulnerability. It is the small, ordinary choices we make, pulling over, walking home alone, entering a social space late, that place us in a position to be seen. The night magnifies that vulnerability. It also reveals the kinds of people who will exploit it, the man who pretends to be helpful, the person who wears the language of piety while touching what they should not, those who film for trophies, and also the accidents of grief and human frailty that can cause the same cascade of damage. Before we close, a quick practical note. If anything you heard tonight is triggering, please consider reaching out to local support services. We include a brief list in the episode notes with hotlines and resources for survivors of assault and harassment, and we urge you to use them if you need immediate help. There is no shame in asking for support. Also, thank you to the people who sent these stories. To preserve dignity and safety, some details were condensed and, in one case, explicitly combined into a composite vignette. Every submission is read with care. If you have a story to send, you can find submission instructions in the description. We read what you send. These 5 tales, 2 from that Arizona highway, the crime scene encounter in the alley, the night at Kidwelly, and the composite fear of being recorded, do not resolve cleanly. That probably frustrates anyone who prefers endings with lockups and sentencing. But it reflects a deeper truth. Many things that happen after dark do not conclude with a neat legal answer. They conclude with repair, with personal boundaries rebuilt, with new habits, and sometimes with continuing fear. They conclude with people who stop driving on certain shoulders, and friends who learn to sit in silence with the haunted. If you took anything from these stories, if you felt the chill of recognition or the urge to reach out to someone, then you have already begun the kind of community that can matter. Here's the final ask. If you want to support the show, consider joining our membership or Patreon via the link in the description. Membership helps us keep the lights on and gives us bandwidth to handle submissions with the care they deserve. You'll also get bonus episodes where we dive deeper into a single submission with consent from the sender. One last thing before I go. When you drive at night, when you walk past an empty park bench, when you stand at your window and look out into a strip of streetlight, remember this: the dark contains real dangers, and it also contains real kindnesses. People like Gary who stop, friends who sit up while you breathe, medics who stitch you back together, and strangers who will not look away. Hold both truths. They will help you navigate a world that is at times frightening and at times quietly merciful. Good night. Be careful out there.